Welcome back to the Caldwell Account. Folks, you remember the very beginning of this program? Very beginning, way back, well, it seems like years ago now, several seasons, but it's been a while. And I said to you that this program would be fearless. I say it on the promos too. We're going to be fearless. You know, what I meant was we would challenge our assumptions. I don't think I said that too. We would be willing to take a look at everything from all sides. Let's look at this whole foreign aid thing. You've heard me now for at least a few days talk about, well, I guess since last week, since the bin Laden killing, you've heard me talk about cutting off aid from Canada, from Britain to the United States, at least to Pakistan, and certainly to other countries like Egypt. And we talked about Barack Obama's speech yesterday, and at least in terms of debt forgiveness, increasing the aid that goes to Egypt. But you just heard a guest that we had, Dr. Aparna Pandey from Washington, D.C., the Hudson Institute, and she disagrees with me. And I want to be clear that you heard what she said, because I did. She explained that you actually have to keep sending money to Pakistan. And this, look, again, I not dime one from this country as far as I'm concerned to Pakistan until they get it sorted out. But she was very straightforward about it. She said, look, you can't just do that, because the only hope you have of keeping a country like Pakistan, where they've got somewhere between 60 and 100 nuclear weapons, from falling into the wrong hands, the way she put it was, you don't want Pakistan to fail, is by trying to support the civilian population there, led by President Zardari, who seems to be at least somewhat reasonable. Now, of course, you say that, but you got the Prime Minister of Pakistan, Jilani, who we just discussed with Dr. Parna as well, in China, talking with people who are not friends to Canada, to the United States, to Great Britain. You say, look, how on earth can that work? How can you have a situation where, you know, you're supporting the president, but the Prime Minister is clearly hostile to the interests of your country, and they're happy to take your money? And again, Canada spends at least $80 million or more going over in aid to Pakistan. And the United States, forget about it, $3 billion, like over $20 billion since 9/11, another $1 billion a year from Great Britain, and so on and so forth. But we continue to unpack this whole foreign aid issue, which was addressed a great deal in President Barack Obama's speech yesterday. And to do that, we're going to be joined right now from Washington, D.C., by probably the smartest guy in this or any other galaxy. He is the purveyor of Frum Forum, frumforum.com. He's an author of about a gazillion books. He is David Frum, and I'm privileged to call him my friend. David, thanks for being with us.
Hey Theo, I hope you've surveyed all the galaxies.
I have. We have.
Otherwise, it might sound like a bit like an overstatement.
Sun News Network has a really broad reach, David. I can't even talk about how broad it is. So trust me, we're taking a look. Alpha Centauri, and beyond. No one's smarter than you. And before I ask you the specific questions that I have, and I have them, I've read your post on Frum Forum about Obama's speech. I want to hear your overall thoughts on Obama's Middle East speech yesterday.
Well, the 4/5 that didn't deal with Israel and Palestine, I thought were very helpful. In many ways, the president has moved a huge distance from where he was in 2008. Remember when he said, he was asked, would you meet with dictators like Iran's Ahmadinejad? And he said yes. Now he's saying that actually dictatorship and economic oppression are the fundamental problem in the region, and he is aligning himself, as George Bush aligned himself, against those forces. So that's all positive. I think he had some important things to say about Syria, some real warnings there. That's positive. He then tacked on this last fifth of the speech, which in many ways wasn't directly necessary, and I think is distracting attention from the positive things he said in the other 4/5.
Okay, and you mean that fifth being about Israel and Palestine, right?
Right.
David? Okay.
That's where he's gotten himself into a bit of trouble, because he's involving himself in a problem that isn't ready to be solved right now.
Okay. Let me just deal with that. First of all, I think probably everyone in this galaxy knows you were a speechwriter for George W. Bush.
Right.
But we'll get to the Israel thing in a second. I think you and I could go all day long on that. Let me just ask you about the rest of the content of the speech. One, I'm a little frustrated, David, that people are giving Obama so much credit for saying, well, corruption and dictatorship in the Middle East is a problem. Okay, mail that to like 50 years ago when the rest of the world figured that out. He's coming out and saying this, and we're supposed to act as though it's a great thing. You yourself have pointed out this is, and you said just now, something that George W. Bush would say. Yeah, you might have written it for George W. Bush, and he would have been right. So would you. So now we're supposed to act like it's a big deal that Barack Obama has finally caught up with it. Now, in terms of bringing in the Israel-Palestine question, you know the left can't order a cheese sandwich without roping Israel into it, talking about the Middle East. But Syria, yes. He said important stuff about Syria. You know what he said about Syria, David? He said that Assad has an opportunity to lead the democratic movement in the Middle East. How can that be, David, when he's killing his own people as the speech was being made?
Well, here's where it's a distance. And during the Clinton administration, the Warren Christopher, who's then Bill Clinton's Secretary of State, met with Hafez Assad, the president dictator's father, more often than any other world leader, more often than the president of France, Prime Minister of Canada, Prime Minister of Britain. So the days in which, at least we've got this progress, that the Assad family are not being treated like people to be kissed up to all the time, that the United States is taking cognizance of the fact that they are a pretty nasty bunch of dictators. And that represents an important change. And I don't know that when Obama said your choice is A or B, that he had a lot of faith that it was going to be A, that Assad would lead the democratic transition. I think we're getting ready for a world in which there's going to be a lot more pressure on Syria, and that's a good thing.
Okay, but you know what? I would say, David, when you have someone like Assad, who, as I said, is killing his own people, maybe not up to the 20,000 his dad killed in Hama and then paved over there in 1982 and then paved over their remains, but certainly up in the hundreds and thousands by now. When you say anything about that guy besides he's got to go or he's a monster, I think that is kissing up. We're only weeks removed from Secretary of State Hillary Clinton saying he's a reformer, albeit quoting members of Congress who said the same thing. I think anything besides saying Assad is a monster and has to go, about which, by the way, Obama was happy to say that, about which he was happy to say of. He said that about Gaddafi on March 3rd. Gaddafi's got to go for attacking his own people. So why why does he get that treatment, but Assad gets, You
just put your finger on the key fact, because the war against Gaddafi is not going very well. If Gaddafi were gone by now, the United States and its friends could say to Assad, see what happened to that guy? You better follow. But precisely because we are bogged down in an unsuccessful war in Libya, it makes it difficult to apply authority to Syria. So one of the most important things when you say what presidents say is a function of their power from what they do. If the war in Libya were more successful, the president would have more credibility right now. He's dealing in this speech with a problem, and the problem is he's got 3 wars, none going all that well, and he doesn't have the clout that a more successful president would have.
Okay, but let's deal with that Libya issue for just a second. In the speech, Obama said that if the United States, its allies, hadn't acted, thousands of civilians would have been killed in Libya. I'll give him that. That's true. But I'd also say, David, that if they'd acted sooner, if they hadn't waited for UN approval and NATO and a rubber stamp from the Arab League and all the rest of it, if they've acted sooner, instead of making sure that the issue was multilateral, instead of just taking out the guy, then not only would thousands have been saved, but you'd have it resolved by now. So when I say I'm frustrated with people giving Obama credit for this speech, first of all, he's late to the Arab Spring. This has been going on for a very long time, and to act like he's been part of it from the beginning is just wrong. And second, to act as though, if he has a weak hand dealing with Syria, because of Libya, as you said, well, that's his own fault, David. It's because he's leading from behind again and again.
That is totally his own fault. And there's one more point that you could add to the indictment, which is where was he during the Iranian summer of 2009, when there were huge protests in the Iranian capital, brutally suppressed, and Obama for about 10 days really held his counsel, because at that point he was hoping he could do business with the Iranian government. If Iran had been subjected to the kind of pressure even that Syria is now being subjected to, it might have galvanized public opinion in Iran. There were a lot of people who held back, not sure which side was going to win. The United States was quiet, the government side won, and we have now again, a much weaker hand than we otherwise could have.
David, I have stopped, at least for this broadcast today, stopped bringing up that 2009 Iranian thing, because it makes me so Orlando Furioso. I can't even contain myself about it, because the opportunity was there, and you probably have written something about this on Frum Forum or elsewhere, for the President of the United States just to say something in 2009, after the election was stolen by Ahmadinejad and the mullahs, to say something in support of those Iranian protesters, and he said nothing. Not talking about bombs or going to war or anything with Iran. Just say something. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Just words. And he didn't. He was too busy condemning the Cambridge Police Department at the time. So you talked at the top of this discussion. You talked about Iran, and he felt he could do business with them. And you talked about during the campaign, he said he'd have no preconditions, and how far the president for negotiating with Iran, and how far he's come. Well, so what, why learn on the job? Why come so far? And what have you gotten for all this sucking up? I think he's still doing it, frankly, like I said with Assad. I just don't see him leading, taking a line that a president should take with people who are dictators and tyrants.
When you say, why is he learning on the job? Well, if you elect somebody, and he was elected, who doesn't know the job, then they have to learn on the job. But still, points for learning as opposed to not learning. And one of the things that I think we can be a little optimistic about is whereas the Carter administration over its 4 years in many ways got more clueless, this administration is showing itself to be becoming maybe a little less clueless. And we can be optimistic about that and hopeful. The big questions about the Arab Spring, of course, are in the hands of the people in the Arab world themselves. Will the Egyptians be able to move their way to a more decent form of government? One of the things that Mubarak did in his last days was to open up the jails and to allow a lot of thugs and criminals out of prison. And they have now been on a crime rampage through the streets of Cairo. You've been reading about this in some of the newspapers, about how terrified even the police now are of the criminality in Cairo. Can Egypt put itself in order? That's what? A quarter of the population of the Arab world lives in just that one country.
Yeah, well, I want to ask you about Egypt in just a second, but I'm still hung up on the whole he's better than Carter thing. I mean, is that going to be the 2012 bumper sticker campaign? Less clueless than Carter? Is that what he's going to do? Because if that's the bar, but
look,
go ahead.
He's not my guy. I'm telling you that as you nervously watch what is happening, as you nervously listen to this president's actions over the past 2 years, less clueless than Carter. Counts for something.
Let me ask you about Egypt since you brought it up. I have wondered about the massive amounts of U.S. aid that have gone to Egypt over the years. As you know, Hosni Mubarak, whom you mentioned, letting out the criminals and everything, Castro did something similar at a different point in his career. The guy's a really wealthy guy, right? Because of misbegotten aid coming from overseas.
Right.
And now the president, he didn't say anything that I understood of cutting off aid. We don't even know who's going to be running Egypt in going forward. And then up to $1 billion of debt forgiven. That sounds like even more aid. What's your take, David, on the constant support to Egypt from the United States, and particularly when we don't even know who's going to be running Egypt in the coming weeks?
Right. Well, the thing Egypt desperately needs, private sector-led economic growth. And here's a way to dramatize what's happened there. When Hosni Mubarak took power in 1981, Egypt at that point was a much richer society than China. The average income in Egypt was about 2.5 times the average income in China. Today, China is a richer society than Egypt by about 75%. Half the population of Egypt lives on less than $2 a day. And an enormous number, I forget the statistic, I think it's maybe 1/3, of people in Egypt who draw a salary, that is not the farmers, but people who get wages, are employed by government in one form or another. You have this huge overmanned public sector, badly paid, not very efficient. They hand out jobs just to keep people employed and so that they have something to eat and so they don't revolt against the government. Egypt needs to go through an amazing economic transition. I mean, here's this. It's great. Why are the mouse pads and the computer components for all of Europe not manufactured in Egypt? Why aren't textiles manufactured in Egypt? Why isn't Egypt a source of cut flowers for the European market? This is not a private sector-led economy, and it is that kind of dynamic economic change that Egypt needs to see if it's going to de-radicalize, if it's going to be a successful society for its people.
Okay, listen, I want to get to that 1/5 of the speech that you mentioned at the top, and that is Palestine, Israel, and this whole side of it. The president called for a return to 1967 borders, which will involve Gaza, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights, going back to, well, no longer under Israel's control.
We're not so sure about the Golan Heights.
Okay, well, which is actually my biggest question about it. But go ahead. What was your take on the Israel-Palestine portion of the speech?
Look, I don't worry about it that much because the conditions the president laid down, if the dispute between the Israelis and the Palestinians were about where to draw the borders, this argument would be so close to being solved anyway. That the Palestinians still do not accept the very concept of peace with Israel. We saw that repeatedly over the past decade. And what we see most recently is this effort to go to the United Nations in September to get a resolution to recognize an independent Palestine, after which the Palestinians will wage a kind of legal campaign against Israel, as the Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas said in his New York Times op-ed this past weekend. So it isn't a border dispute. So it doesn't matter what the president says about the borders. What matters is, will they accept the principle of living in peace alongside a Jewish Israel? Will they accept the principle of doing what is necessary to guarantee Israel's security, not just against terrorism, not just against rockets, but against the incursions from Iranian forces on the other side of the Jordan River? And those are things that are completely unacceptable to almost everybody in a position of authority in the Palestinian world. Yeah,
and we said this as well. I'm glad to hear you say it, David. The idea that the borders are the issue, or that land for peace is going to work, isn't. It's been tried. It doesn't work. And Mahmoud Abbas says they're never going to give up on right of return, as you say. I don't see anything practical in this. I see this as just more left-wing faculty lounge, cookie-cutter answers to this very complicated question. David Frum, smartest guy in the universe, thank you so much for joining us on this. Frumforum.com is where you find him.
Thank you.
Cheers, David.
Thank you, Theo.